at least 5 to 10 minutes for Q&A with a speaker at the end. And with that, I want to turn things over to my colleague, Patrina, to get us started.
Hi, everyone, and good afternoon or morning, depending upon where you are. I'm really excited to talk to you today about avoiding control deficiencies. Control deficiencies have a couple of implications, but the two primary ones are that they can negatively impact your audit. So if a SOC 2 audit and a clean SOC 2 report is important to you, this is something that you want to pay attention to. And it can also expose you to vulnerabilities. Controls are intended to reduce risk in your organization. And so if you have a control that fails, whatever risk that control was intended to mitigate, you're vulnerable to. So today, we're going to be talking about a couple of things. First of all, I'm going to give you an overview of controls so we're all on the same page about what a control is. And then I'm going to share with you some common reasons why controls fail. And I'll also share some practical tips on how you can prevent a control deficiency. And then I'll just give a quick demo of HyperProof, which is a really innovative solution that can help you manage your compliance operations efficiently and effectively, and also address some of these strategies that I'm talking about today. Now you may be saying, who is this person and why is she talking to us about this? Well, I'm actually the Director of Channel Partnerships at HyperProof, and I am absolutely passionate about risk and compliance. I've been in this space for a long time. I'm a CPA, and I'm a Certified Information Systems Security Professional. And before I joined HyperProof, I actually worked for a Big Four firm in their professional services organization, and I did a lot of engagements across the second and third lines of defense. So what does that mean? I helped stand up compliance programs, I helped with remediation, I did readiness assessments, I issued SOC 2 reports, and I also did AWS security assessments just to give you a little bit of flavor about the sort of things that I've done. And I've done this for organizations of all sizes across various industries, ranging from startups through mid-size and even global companies. Outside of work, my life looks a lot different than what I just described. First of all, I'm an avid yogi, and I live in beautiful Utah and spend a lot of time hiking and mountain biking. Oh, and I love classic jazz music, the true giants, Thelonious Monk, Van Getz, Miles Davis. And when I'm not doing that, I'm chasing after my 2 energetic kids. And for many parents right now, my kids are home doing remote learning, and so that's been interesting, to say the least. So let's just say I've been doing a lot more yoga and meditation to navigate that. Let's start with the basics of controls. So, as I mentioned, controls are really intended to help you reduce risk. You can't totally eliminate it because then you wouldn't really be in business if you blocked everything that could introduce a risk. So the idea is that you set a risk tolerance level, which is specific to every organization, and it's an acceptable level of risk that you are comfortable assuming. To give you an example of that is access removal. Most organizations have a control that says that when an employee leaves your organization or is terminated, you'll remove their access within 24 hours. So basically, that's an example of risk acceptance. For hours 1 through 23, that employee has access. And so organizations say for those 23 hours, we'll accept that risk of that terminated employee having access. We'll just remove it after that. And so that's like an acceptable risk for many organizations. So how do controls reduce risk? Will they prevent things from happening? They detect things from happening when they do. And in many cases, they can correct things from happening. Now, an example of correcting something is like a backup control. So if a backup control restores your system to its previous state before a failure. So that's just an example of backup. Now, there's many ways to kind of slice and dice categories of controls. I know that many of you watching this may have a different perspective, but I'm sharing with you 4 different typical categories or buckets that you put controls in. The first is physical controls. So those are things that you can see and touch and usually are intended to protect your infrastructure. So things like doors, locks on your server room, security cameras, stuff like that. Then there's procedural controls, which are like the processes that you have in your organization. So what is your incident management response, security training? How do you conduct risk assessments? Those are typical types of procedural controls. And technical controls, which are probably resonate with a lot of you and are fairly common, things like user authentication, your passwords, your network security, your antivirus software. And finally, the last kind of bucket of controls are your legal and regulatory controls. So these are the policies and the standards that you've established within your organization. So now that we know about what controls are, let's talk about how they're evaluated. And controls are evaluated across a number of fronts. And the way that I'm going to be talking about is how auditors typically evaluate your controls, which is an important factor if your goal is to kind of have a clean audit, right? So the first factor is the risk. If controls are intended to address risk, it's important to make sure that whatever your risk is, that the control appropriately addresses that risk. So let's just say you have a risk of, an engineer promoting some bad code to a production environment, either intentionally or unintentionally. Now, a password policy, which is how complex your password needs to be, things like that, it's a great control, but it really doesn't address that risk. It addresses a different type of risk. So if you're really trying to address the risk of an engineer promoting some bad code to production, you would want a control that maybe scanned the code for known issues or incorporated a peer review process. So that type of a control more appropriately addresses the risk. The other factor is the design of the control. How effective is it? And this is looked at from a people, process, and technology perspective, as well as frequency. So a frequency example is how often the control is performed. So for vulnerability management, like your patching processes, if you're only deploying patches once a year, that may not be effective. Typically, organizations deploy patches daily and many times, multiple times a day. And so once a year would probably be an ineffective design. The last factor is consistency and performance. And this is basically saying that the control is working at the time intervals that it's supposed to and in the manner that it was. So if you have access reviews that are supposed to be conducted quarterly, they should consistently be done quarterly and not kind of semi-annually or annually. So let's talk now about some common reasons why controls fail. And there's going to be many reasons why controls fail, but I'm just going to share several common themes that are actually pretty easy to see and can be addressed fairly easily if you're aware of it. So the first reason why controls can fail that I'm going to discuss is that somebody didn't perform the control process. And this happens for a lot of reasons. People change jobs, they leave your organization, they go on amazing vacations, and more recently, people are getting sick, and they're getting sick very unexpectedly. And when things like that happen, the control processes that the people that we're supposed to do sometimes can fall through the cracks. They may be performed late or maybe not even performed at all. So several examples of scenarios where this can happen can be in your software updates and patching process. Let's say that you don't have a centralized patch management function. Instead, you've got multiple people that are responsible for deploying patches to their various IT systems. Now, if an IT manager forgets and goes on a leave of absence or is out of office, that patch that that IT manager was responsible for deploying does not get deployed. And we all know that failing to patch your systems appropriately can lead to some serious consequences. The next example that I'm going to share is coordinating penetration testing. I typically see penetration testing outsourced and performed usually once a year. It's usually outsourced to a third-party provider who, has expertise in doing penetration testing. So if you have an individual in your company that's responsible for coordinating penetration testing with a third-party provider, and they decide to leave your organization, and because they only do that coordination once a year, they maybe forgot to transition that to their manager or the person replacing them before they leave. Well, in that scenario, arranging for the annual penetration testing may fall through the cracks. The last example that I'm going to give is around updating your policies. Most control frameworks have a requirement that say on an annual basis you have to review your security policies and make sure they're still sufficient and sign off on them. So because this happens once a year, this is typically not top of mind. It's usually, although it's very important, it's usually not like 90% of somebody's job. It's something they do once a year. So if your head of security is responsible for doing this, maybe they put like a reminder on their calendar that, once a year they have to do this. But if they leave your organization, a month or two before they were supposed to do that, and then it's time for your audit, you may not have performed that review of the security policy. It may have fallen through the cracks. So let's talk about how you can fix this. You can fix this by really having governance and oversight, having visibility into the performance and responsibilities of your control process. One, who's responsible for doing it? Knowing who your control owners are. Two, knowing when control processes are supposed to be performed. And finally, having some sort of notification if the control processes aren't performed when they're supposed to. Because let's face it, things happen. So having a system that notifies you that a control process wasn't performed that was supposed to is important. And also, it's important to have a little bit of redundancy. Trust me, I'm all about efficiency, and we'll talk about building efficient compliance programs and operations, but it's also important to make sure you have redundancy, especially for your most critical controls. So again, I'm going to talk about SOC 2 a lot because it's pretty in demand. Lately, it seems like a company won't talk to you if you don't have a SOC 2 report. So with SOC 2, you have trust service criteria. And if you only have one control mapped to that trust service criteria and it fails, then you're subject to a qualified opinion, which, although it sounds good, is actually bad. A qualified opinion is bad. So you want to make sure that you have some redundancy, so if the first control fails, you have something else that addresses the risk. And finally, it's important to train your control operators and make sure everyone's aware of their responsibilities. The next reason that I'm going to discuss about common control failures is the control language or the design of the control being out of date. So again, a control is a person, a process, or a piece of technology. And those things change from time to time, especially in a startup environment. In startups, things change rapidly. How you do things and the person who's doing them can look very different from one month to the next. So in that situation, it's important to make sure that what you're doing in reality matches what you've designed, the design of the control, and how you've memorialized that in your control language. Here's an example. Let's say that you're using Jira as your access request system for Salesforce. So anybody who wants access to Salesforce needs to submit a Jira ticket. So that's the control design. And then you start using ServiceNow. So people start requesting access to Salesforce by issuing a ServiceNow ticket. And then it comes time for your audit, right? And so your auditors are looking at your controls and saying, hey, I'm seeing some access requested in a JIRA ticket was an issue. And then you say, well, because we're using ServiceNow. Well, now you're subject to a control deficiency because you didn't change the design of your control. So it's really important to make sure that your control languages are up to date and they match your control environment. So how do you fix that? The easy way to fix it is to really set a cadence to review the design of the control. Now, I'm not talking about reviewing the performance of the control. I'm talking about reviewing the language of the control design. And so that should be periodically reviewed according to the risk that it has in your organization. So a high-risk area is entitlements review. So when you're thinking about role-based access, the privileges, the privileges that you've assigned to each role, that the structure of that role-based access and the associated privileges, you may want to review those quarterly. And then a medium risk might be vulnerability management, your patching process. How often are you deploying patches and which applications are included in your patching process, things like that. The design of the process, you might want to review that quarterly or maybe even semi-annually. And finally, a lower risk area is something like your employee onboarding process. What is the process that employees go through as they get introduced and acclimated and integrated into your organization? You might want to look at that process annually. The last kind of common risk that I'm going to be talking about is the risk that your compliance framework has been updated and you haven't built out any sort of new controls or maybe even redesign your controls to satisfy those new control requirements. A few years ago, I used to do a lot of work in the financial services space, and at the time, there were changing regulations all the time, and so the financial institutions really needed to stay on top of these changing regulations and build out controls to support them. Now, that environment's changed a lot, but one new emerging environment is SOC 2. So as I mentioned, it seems like with all of this focus on third-party risk, SOC 2 is becoming a very important component of your compliance program because your customers and vendors are asking you for them. So SOC 2, that framework has evolved over time. And in the past couple of years, if you've had a SOC 2 in the past couple of years, you know that you've needed to build out new controls periodically as the new expectations have been rolled out. So things such as the points of focus and service level commitments and clarity on addressing cyber risk. Those are all things that have changed over the past couple of years. And so you've needed to be aware of it. And after you're aware, obviously adapt your control framework and controls to support those new requirements. So how do you keep on top of all this stuff? Well, it's all about awareness, right? It's about putting yourself in a position where you become informed of changes to these compliance expectations and requirements. So a couple of ways that you can put yourself in a situation to stay informed is one, regularly check these sites for updated standards. Two is stay up to date. Sign up for updates from the standards issuers such as the AICPA or NIST or ISO. The third one is joining a professional association. These groups are typically, on top of what's coming around the pipeline, how do you address what is in the pipeline now and things like that. You can also use a regulatory monitoring service. And finally, full disclosure, I'm partial to professional services firms because I've spent a lot of time in that. But it's actually very helpful to consult with an advisory firm to understand, one, which requirements are applicable to me, how do I incorporate them, what do I need to think about, and things like that. So really, the key takeaway is that, controls are a really important part of your overall risk management strategy. And when they fail, not only does it introduce risk into your organization, but it also can impact your audit results, which can be very detrimental. So strong governance and oversight is needed of your compliance operation and your compliance program in general. One, it's important to have visibility into who's responsible for what. And as people change, you make adjustments and pivot. It's important to monitor what you've stood up. I mean, you can stand up something beautifully on day one, but you have to make sure that on an ongoing basis, the things that you thought were happening are consistently happening when they're supposed to and how they're supposed to. And then from time to time, it's good to revisit the design of your controls. One, to make sure that what you're doing in reality matches what you've designed the control to be, and also make adjustments as you learn more about, risks and nuances and things like that. And finally, it's important to stay up to date with all of your new expectations within the compliance frameworks. So now I'm going to share a demo of Hyperproof with you. And as I mentioned, Hyperproof is an innovative SaaS solution. I'm actually very passionate about Hyperproof because having lived in spreadsheets for so many years in the risk and compliance space, I think that Hyperproof has a lot of innovative features that help you in a very intuitive way manage compliance and make sure your compliance operations are effective. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So this is Hyperproof. This is the main page that you see when you log into the application. Down here is a great view of all of your compliance programs and the status of where they're at. And then at the top of the screen is your organizational view, which is a roll-up of all of your compliance programs. And you can see from this view the current state of them. So you can see how many controls you've built out across each compliance program. And then Hyperproof operates on the concept of continuous compliance. So I can see now that I have some controls that I expected to operate, but evidence is expired for those controls. And so that tells me that, one, either the control wasn't performed, or maybe it was performed, but but the evidence wasn't uploaded, which might make your upcoming audit a little bit more inefficient. This is your Programs tab, and I really like this tab because it gives you a deep dive of your specific compliance programs. So the first thing that jumps out at me, this is a SOC 2 program, and the first thing that jumps out is I see I have 190 empty controls. And this means either that the control didn't operate, right, or there isn't any evidence attached to that control, which, as I mentioned, can make your audit a little bit more inefficient. So if you click on this, I can see actually which controls don't have evidence, and I could go continue to click through, and I have the opportunity to add evidence right here and upload it. And Hyperproof is browser-based, so you can just click your back browser button. The other thing that I absolutely love about this is I mentioned the concept of continuous compliance. So you can set a timing policy on your controls and then of when you're expecting to see evidence. And then Hyperproof will go and look for the evidence, and if it's not there, it marks it as expired, and it actually sends a notification to your control owners and the team to upload that evidence, and they send continuous reminders. But you can also click here and drill down and say, oh, these are my controls that I'm looking for, I'm looking for evidence on, and I need to go upload it. So you see basically what's past due, and then you can action it. This is really innovative. This is like my favorite piece of Hyperproof. And I actually, like I said, I lived in spreadsheets, and so this functionality really gets me excited. So Hyperproof is all about efficiency. And we know when you're designing a control, you try to get the most bang for your buck. If you can design one control that satisfies multiple control requirements, you're being very efficient. I know I talked about redundancy, but I'm also concerned about efficiency. So this basically tells me that I have 6 controls that are satisfying 4 or more control requirements, which is great. It means I'm making my compliance operations more efficient. So I can click on here, and I can see that this one control, production monitoring of servers, actually satisfies 5 different requirements. So that means I'm being very efficient. And it helps, so over time, it can help you streamline it. You could move these 171 controls only are satisfying 1 requirement. So over time, maybe you could redesign some of these controls so they start to satisfy 2 or 3 requirements footprint and get a little bit more bang for your buck. So now I'm going to share the control view. I love this view as well. So I just got done sharing with you one of the common control failures is that, you know, a person responsible for a control leaves your organization for whatever reason. So with this view, I can see that my good friend Eddie Bauer is responsible for 7 controls. And maybe Eddie is out of the office or on vacation or unfortunately on a leave of absence. I can then click on this control and I can reassign Eddie's control to somebody else on the team. And so this helps me make sure that, you know, if somebody if somebody can no longer perform the control processes, you can quickly reassign it and keep the wheels going on your compliance program. You can also click here and do bulk updates. So if there's multiple controls, you can select them and then update it right here. Also, with labels, this is another great feature of Hyperproof. So the concept of labels is that labels are basically containers for evidence. So you can upload your evidence in a label bucket, and you could do multiple things with that bucket. So let's talk about change management, right? So with change management, you usually are looking for a couple of things, right? You're usually looking for some evidence that something was tested, something was reviewed, and something was approved. You can put that in one bucket, a label, and just upload it one time, and then it can map to multiple different controls. So these different controls probably are all looking for some sort of evidence of change management. So instead of uploading these 3 pieces of evidence 3 different times, you put it in a label, and the label automatically maps to these 3 controls. Another great thing about this is that, let's just say, you know, there's multiple people who may be responsible for these types of evidence, and they don't care about this mapping. This is typically something maybe a compliance manager would care about. The compliance manager knows that this evidence will satisfy these 3 requirements. So the compliance manager can actually, you know, your compliance manager can actually create a bucket, create a folder on their Google Drive, and ask different IT engineers to upload evidence into this folder on their Google Drive. And then, and we have a lot of integration, so you don't just have to use Google Drive. You can use any of these other sites. It could be your S3 bucket, it could use Dropbox, SharePoint, etc. But your compliance manager can create this folder and tell different IT engineers, upload your evidence into this Google Drive, right? And then it automatically, in your label, you can set it up where it will pull it in, and it'll pull it in, and then your IT manager doesn't have to know this mapping because it gets pulled into the bucket. Then that mapping is already there, and it's satisfying these requirements. So the other thing about labels is you can assign a freshness policy. So as I talked about, For things like your security policies that you may want to just do once a year, you can create a bucket and put your security policies in there, and then you can set a rule that says that, once a year, these need to be refreshed. And if they're not refreshed on time, then it's going to be marked as expired, and you'll get that notification, and it'll go to your team members. And at Hyperproof, you also don't have to use the labels. Obviously, you can, but at Hyperproof, we call proof things like your evidence or your artifacts and stuff like that. So you can upload it here, and then, you have the option of either kind of putting it in a label container or mapping it directly to a control. Let's see. Oh, I forgot. One last thing is that I shared with you some programs here. So Hyperproof also has a really cool wizard of creating a new program. So if you want to, let's just say you want to do a new GDPR program or something, we have loaded some predefined templates here if you're starting a new compliance program. And you can actually go through, and I'll just see, let's see, we'll stick with the SOC 2. Let's just say you're starting a new SOC 2. Our templates already have some requirements, and it's got some predefined controls in case you're just starting out. So you can see our template already has these, and you have the option of using our baseline controls. These are controls that we're giving you as a starting point, and if you don't want to use our own controls and you have your own, you can go ahead and unclick this box and use yours as well. So it's an easy way to stand up a new program or actually manage it on an ongoing basis. So with that, so I guess the key kind of take, I guess with that, I just think the Hyperproof is a great solution for managing your compliance. And I know I covered a lot of stuff today. So maybe we can open it up now for a few questions and answers. So JC, I don't know if you'd like to maybe share some questions and answers. And I'll share some answers.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, everyone. If you have any questions, please type them into your question box. And let's just take a quick moment there because it takes about a second or so for me to see your questions. But we do have some that are already here, so let's just start with those. We have one question around control design specifically, and the question is, what are common areas that you found redundancies are important?
Well, I actually think redundancy is always important. And so I just got done talking about efficiency, right? So it is important. You don't want to have unnecessary efficiency. If you have a risk, right, and it's a pretty high level risk, you may want to have, 2 or maybe even 3 kind of like safeguards. So somebody inappropriately accessing your system is a little bit of you'd want redundancy there. And so that's why you have things like you'll have a password policy. You might have multi-factor authentication. You might have access reviews. You might have somebody monitoring who's accessing applications and who's trying to access applications. So those are kind of like, multiple stages. If one of those things fails, you have another kind of safeguard to actually look at it. If your password's compromised, maybe through multi-factor authentication, they still can't access the system, or through, your network monitoring, you can see that somebody's inappropriately accessing it. So those high-risk areas, that makes a lot of sense. But there are some, maybe lower risk areas where you don't need that much redundancy. But I always say I think you should have at least one redundancy even for low risk areas, because if that control fails, right, and you've got a risk defined, or you've got a compliance control requirement and that control fails, and then you don't have something else to address the risk that the compliance requirement is addressing, then your report, your compliance assessment is probably going to be unfavorable because it's going to say this risk was not addressed. So you always want to make sure that all the risks are addressed and that you have a kind of a plan B if your first control doesn't fail, happens to fail.
Thank you.
Do we have another question,
Yes. What's a good checklist of considerations when designing a control? How do you make sure that it's as effective as it could be?
I think that kind of goes back to, let's see, we had a slide earlier that talked a little bit about this, about the factors of how it's being assessed against. Let's see, I think that was this one. Oh, yep. So here's kind of like a checklist, and each one of these things would have consideration in it, right? So when really just kind of taking a step back and saying, this is a great control, but this is the risk I'm trying to solve for, and how well does this control really solve for the risk? And then how the design of it, again, is from the people, process, and technology thing, is each one of those has different considerations. From the people perspective, it's about, does it make sense for this person to be doing it? And one of the things is, are they competent, right? Are they competent? Sometimes the person needs to be independent, things like that. And so there'll be different factors across each of the people, process, and technology and perspective. And then frequency, again, is about the risk. It's about the level of the risk. So, you know, we talked a little bit about things like revisiting control designs. So vulnerability management, right, deploying patches, that's something that you want a high frequency for because it's high risk. You know, if you basically, if there's a patch and the patch is including a resolution to a key security risk or a key security issue, you want to make sure that that patch is deployed as soon as possible. So that's, you know, when you're thinking about what the process is, you want to also kind of think about the risk as it relates to frequency. And then again, just like the consistency, can the control be consistently performed? If the control is so complicated or convoluted that it's hard to do it consistent, you may want to revisit how that control is designed, because you want, you know, compliance to, just to operate, right? You don't want it to be a painful experience. And when it is a painful or even too complex, that's where issues can happen as well.
All right. Thank you very much. Taking another look to see if there are additional questions.
Okay.
Well, it looks like that's all we had from folks on the line today. With that, we can end a bit early and give you guys some time back. Patrina, is there any last comments you wanted to add and anything you wanted to say to folks on the line?
Yeah, well, I know that we covered a lot today, and that, you know, if you go to our website, hyperproof.io, you know, we are more than happy to, you know, have a dialogue with you about, you know, how Hyperproof can be leveraged to better support your compliance operations and address risks. So please reach out to us.
Well, with that, thank you so much, Patrina, for this insightful presentation.
Yeah, happy to share. I hope everyone has a great day.
Take care, everyone. Bye.